I want to cut to the chase and just talk about the theory that has dominated the study of emotion and aging in the last 20 years, and that's socio-emotional selectivity theory. It's a theory that, as many of you know, posits that as we gain an increased awareness that our time in life is growing shorter, we focus more on emotional goals. This greater focus influences our decisions, our thoughts, and our behaviors in ways that enhance our experiences of well-being. And I would confidently say hundreds of studies have used socio-emotional selectivity theory to discuss why, for example, older adults are appraising things more positively, are remembering past events as either more positive or less negative, and are generally reporting higher levels of well-being than our younger adults. And the study has been going strong, but there has been a minority voice that sometimes has results that don't fit into this theory. For example, people say, well, yes, older adults are posited to be better now at regulating their emotions, and we find this appraisals and these memories, but for example, some types of emotion regulation strategies, such as when asking people to suppress their emotional reactions, we find no age differences. Sometimes when people are asked to down-regulate negative emotions, like in research by Michelle Scioto and Levinson, that older adults report slightly more problems with that. And so we also know, for example, that when faced with a stressor, Uccino's work and others have shown a greater reactivity of blood pressure in response. And so how do we reconcile these findings as well in socio-emotional selectivity theory? So a theory that we put together in my lab that we think explains some of these discrepancies is strength and vulnerability integration. Now, I don't want us to spend a lot of time on the details, but what I want you to take away from this idea is that we do think with aging is related to changes in our time perspective, and so it incorporates socio-emotional selectivity theory. Also awareness of our own limitations and memories and knowledge of our life experience that people like Freda Blanchard-Fields and others have discussed, that then give us strengths in how we appraise, process, and regulate our emotions. And most of those strengths are in the ability to be very good at avoiding negative experiences. I don't know if Kara Burdett is in the audience. She did a wonderful paper showing, again, that older adults, when they report being able to get away from these experiences, they do better than their younger counterparts. But when faced with these adverse situations, they report even greater distress. So these strengths are in avoiding or getting out of these negative situations. That's not always possible, and when it doesn't, we do have vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities will then arise, and that's why we no longer will see age-related increases in well-being and regulation, and sometimes older adults might look even worse. Now, I think the most important part of this idea is in the integration, and we need a better picture that has an even stronger box. So that box is the main point of this whole theory. And that box is saying we need to understand the situation. We need to understand the context both within the individual, whether it's cognitive declines, whether it's high levels of neuroticism that are constraining our ability to use our strengths. We also need to look at the context outside the individual. If you lose someone you love intensely, who gives you a sense of purpose, a sense of well-being, and makes you feel safe, that's a difficult situation to appraise away or to focus on something else. So there are situations, if you are confronted and bombarded with stressors consistently that don't allow you that time, that respite to appraise differently, to remember things in a way, when you are constantly bombarded, you will not be able to use these strengths. This, I think, is beautifully illustrated in a recent study I wish I had done, but Hannah Swift and her colleagues did, where they looked at well-being just in different countries, replicating, of course, right, the finding that we have consistently found in the United States and findings in Germany and some in Canada of the age-related increase in well-being. Well, they do not find it in countries that have a lower GDP than richer countries. So the way I'm interpreting this is that older adults, financial problems are a source of stress, and when confronted with chronic sources of stress, we don't predict that older adults will have these higher levels of well-being. So it's the situation. And so even in a more prosperous country like the United States, well, we see the situation at work in modifying the emotions and these age-related patterns. So Dave Almeida and I looked at his wonderful data that he collected through Midas 2, looking at daily diary of over 2,000 people over 8 days. They reported the emotions they experienced and the stressors that they also experienced. And what we found was that we were interested in looking at these age patterns of negative affect. First, we wanted to look at just how are people reporting negative affect. We included covariates like gender, education, ethnicity, but we were just interested in age differences in negative affect, just with those covariates. Then we were interested in whether these patterns change if you adjust for daily stressors, if you adjust for the numbers of stressors in their lives. And what we found is that it did change age patterns. So this is tiny, but this is the average negative affect people experience, not a lot every day. There is an age-graded decrease from age 34 of our younger group to, they average about 42 years old, the younger group, to as old as 85, so about 74 years old in the older group. So they reported less negative affect. But when we included context, so when we adjusted for the daily stressors in their lives, we no longer see an age difference in negative affect. We also looked at the most intense emotion they reported that day, because if you report the high levels of sadness but then nothing else, if we average that together, does that really capture your day? So we were interested in that peak emotion each day, and we looked, we saw an age-graded decrease in this experience. Once we included context, we no longer saw that difference. So we do think for negative affect, it really are the events in the lives that are shaping these age differences that we're finding. For positive affect, we didn't see the same, we see the same pattern of age-related benefits per se. So when just adjusting for the covariates, we see that older adults are reporting slightly more, but significantly higher levels of positive affect. When we adjust for all the uplifts in their lives as well as the hassles in their lives and all the contexts we could think of, we still see this age-related increase in positive affect. This is the peak days of positive affect, and again, we could not take away that age difference. So it really seems to us that negative affect, age differences, were driven more by these events in life. And positive affect seems to stem more from appraisals, maybe appraisals of time left in life and other appraisals that might be driving these age-related differences. So I've been talking about just positive affect and negative affect, and there'll be people who have been thinking about this in very clever ways, like Anthony Ong, who's going to be talking about this topic tomorrow. But when I think of positive affect and negative affect, I think of ourselves as glass. And I think of positive affect as making this glass strong and invulnerable, a resiliency factor that many researchers discuss. Negative affect, people have talked about this negative affect construct in terms of a sensitivity that we have, or a kindling effect that makes us thinner and more brittle. And so when a stressor occurs, the negative, if we consistently have high levels of negative affect when confronted with a stressor, we will be more vulnerable than if we have this resiliency, this strong positive affect. And so when we look at aging, and if we see the older adults have positive in this country, higher levels of positive affect, lower levels of negative affect, it puts them in a different position when confronted with different experiences. Now, people have talked about these mixed emotions, and they've talked about is age related to and like number of factors of emotions, the different types of experience. And what Dave Almeida and I were interested in looking at is not necessarily the number of factors, but what comprises these factors? What is related to these experiences? So again, we turn to the daily diary data. So every night, people were asked about a lot of emotional experiences. They were asked about a series of positive emotions or emotion experiences and a series of negative ones. And we were interested in how these emotions clump together, the factors of these emotions. So first, we were interested in this between subject effect. So we are interested in, much like a personality trait, are there traits of emotions, and are they the same for different age groups? So we divided our sample into 3 age groups, and we were interested in whether the same emotion constellations define who they are and how they vary from one another. And so when we did these factors among these 3 different age groups, what we found was that the 2 younger age groups, the younger, from average about 42 years old, the middle-aged was average about 58 years old, we found that 3 factors really comprised their daily experiences and separated them from one another. So people were angry and anxious, sad, and positive affect just loaded onto one large positive affect factor. So we were a little surprised. Sometimes sadness and anxiety correlate highly together in studies, and sometimes we might expect angry and anxious to be its own separate factors, but there's really these 3 kind of core emotion traits that distinguished these people from one another in these 2 age groups. For the older age group, we found the same 2 negative factors, this angry, anxious, and this sadness factor. But the positive affect actually looked slightly different. So we found the positive affect didn't all clump together on one factor. They were highly correlated factors, 0.7. So really, really very similar. But there was one factor that was the low arousal positive emotions, one factor that was the higher positive, high arousal, like interest, enthusiastic, versus content, satisfied. Now, we don't know whether that has something to do with health, something have to do with other aspects of their situation, but we found that very interesting and provocative, and it reminds us of work that Alexander Freund and others have done, talking about the importance of really focusing on arousal when we start getting older. We were also interested in how emotions varied from one day to the next. So do we have days that vary from levels of different aspects of emotion? The emotion architecture is what we call it. And so now we're looking at within-person factors and seeing how our emotions depicted among these people. And what we found for negative emotions were, for all 3 age groups, negative emotions really form 3 separate factors: sad, anxious, and anger. I put them in slightly varying size to incorporate the levels. So angry was the experience most often. Like irritation, annoyances, that was the most common negative experience. But all 3 age groups, we had these factors. Positive emotions, they were a little different. So for our relatively younger adults, we have 3 positive factors that describe their days and how they vary from one to the other. So there's a cheerful factor. There's an agentic. An agentic factor, these emotions that loaded on this factor are ones that you might experience at work. Proud, enthusiastic, alert, interested. The social one was a factor that related to, do you feel like you belong? Do you feel loved? And so there were 3 separate factors. For the 2 older groups, though, what we found was that agentic and social loaded together, which is very similar to socio-emotional selectivity theory, that our emotions become more social, and levels of pride, levels of feeling energetic were with these more social emotions. And once again, we have this low arousal factor arising for the first time in this older group. It wasn't that the younger adults would say, no, I never feel content. You know, they did endorse this, but it didn't hang together meaningfully, these emotions, to really describe their daily events in the same way it did for older adults. Again, this low arousal, positive emotion that seems to be more important for describing their daily lives. To give you just a little more context for these emotions, looking at another study that Jennifer Piazza, a now colleague of mine, and I did, we looked at just emotions that people reported when they were having conversations with different people in their lives. So in the past week, have you had a conversation where you've talked to someone for at least 15 to 20 minutes? Who were they, and what emotions, of these 19 emotions? So how much happiness did you feel from 1 to 7? From none to extremely? How much pride? And so we asked them about all the emotions they felt in these different situations. And then we looked at these situations separately. We looked at the emotions they reported when they were with their closest friends, emotions they reported when they were with family members, and emotions they reported with new friends. All these people in this study had recently moved to a new residence. So what we found, I'm just going to give you a few examples of these findings. So for example, sense of accomplishment. If you look at differences in younger, who are the lighter, and older adults were reporting the highest sense of accomplishment, and they're reporting it with their family members. I also want to say, for redundancy purposes, I'm not showing you, but pride looked very similar to this. Actually, pride was a lot higher. The older adults reported much higher levels of pride than younger adults with their family members, which also makes me wonder about how we conceptualize pride. When I was hearing that excellent talk about anger and joy, I wonder if the pride that someone feels when they're with their grown child or their grandchild is exactly that same pride we're talking about when you're at work or when you've just finished your run. Also, just to show you, the older adults weren't always reporting the highest levels of positive emotions. Amused was one that younger adults reported in much higher levels across all different types of situations. And this is an example that, in looking at the data, younger people were reporting, when they reported an emotion, a pretty high level, so anything over the midpoint, anything over 3.5 we thought were pretty high. When they were doing that, it was with multiple people. So if they reported high levels of amusement, it was with family members, friends, and sometimes new friends. In this case, with new friends as well. Older adults really only reported these high levels of emotions with family members. I thought it would be family members and close friends. It was predominantly with family members, and sometimes they would also report it with close friends. So if you were just to look at their experience with family members, they had more high emotions and this complex profile than you would look at with these younger adults. Younger adults, though, had these higher emotions with a greater variety of people. So depending on how you look at it would drive how you're interpreting this kind of complexity question. I'm just showing you one example of negative emotions. Younger adults generally reported higher levels of all the negative emotions, more than older adults. So I thought it was slightly less interesting. So I want to leave you all today with one comment, 3 questions, and a plea. Well, my comment was in looking at the data that we are now generating that's looking at these mixed emotions, it seems that negative emotions are less telling for us, less telling in our age differences. We see very similar profiles of negative emotions. And one possibility is that these are tied to our physiology, are tied to our systems in such fundamental evolutionarily derived ways that they are preserved and they're pretty pure. So maybe it would take a lot to dysregulate or make these change with age. Positive emotions, we didn't see that. We saw a lot more play, a lot more movement that were consistent with kind of social integration, and that might be more constructivist, that we're seeing that with our positive emotions. So we see a different profile when we study mix for negative and positive emotions. I just, these questions, I just want us to think about is how does this phenomenon feel? Again, in the last talk, it's like, you just want to feel happy, right? Right? And so I wonder if we're interested in studying, happy, joy. I don't even know if you were to give me the choice. Would you rather have a time with your friend where you feel pure joy? Or how about a time where you feel happy, content, and a mix of, pride? And I don't even know which one I'd prefer. And so kind of understanding what all this means. When are they taking place? And wonderful work in Michigan is looking at this context. I just can't emphasize this enough. And also, when are they useful? I know that we're very tempted to say, how does this correlate with health? Or how does this correlate with prosperity? Or whatever outcome that we want. And I think it also varies by context. And so we need to be very careful when we look at our predictors, making sure we understand when and where. And just the plea again, focusing on the environments. I came of age and aging when we were looking at successful aging. And it was all about, well, sometimes I kind of felt like it was this, well, if you're born wealthy and you stay wealthy and you marry the love of your life and you stay married and you, and it just seemed to be very much an individual process. And I think that when we are really thinking about how our research is going to move and change policy and change how the world is, how the world is aging. When I look at places like Korea, where they're saying that 50% of their older adults are living in poverty, and yet they're the country that's aging even faster now than they project in Japan. When I look at how our research is really going to have to address the lives of these people, I want us to have questions about what kind of context and what kind of situations can we think about for these older adults, as opposed to what kind of trajectories got us there. So thank you.